wait a minute. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Can people hear me?
Yep, absolutely fine.
Excellent, excellent, great. So I've been tasked with e-cigarettes, slim, sexy, and deadly. And when Atul gave me that title, I thought he was talking about me, but unfortunately not. So the new public health emergency. So I've got no actual perceived conflict of interest with regard to this presentation. The aims of the presentation, I'm going to first discuss the enormous diversity of the devices and liquids that are used for vaping and the implications this has for toxicological studies. And I believe that we as pediatricians have to engage energetically with three key questions. The first, what is the acute safety profile of e-cigarettes? The second, what is the chronic long-term safety profile of e-cigarettes? And key, especially to pediatricians, and completely ignored, I'm afraid, by our adult colleagues, is how are e-cigarettes playing out with children and young people? But of course, Atul is wrong, I am wrong, e-cigarettes are very safe. Who says so? Public Health England. Who else says so? The House of Commons. So what would I, as a mere paediatrician, know about it? Public Health England have said that e-cigarettes are at least 95% safer than conventional tobacco cigarettes. MPs say e-cigarette users should be allowed to vape anywhere they like outside. Chairman Norman Lamb MP said, indeed, we were told by the UK Vaping Industry Association that making vapors associated with smokers was equivalent to putting an alcoholic in a bar. Of course, there's no conflict of interest there with the vaping industry or indeed the tobacco industry. And my contention is that e-cigarettes cannot be said to be safer than cigarettes with the knowledge that we have. And also that allowing people to vape freely outside in front of children and young people is the equivalent of putting a paedophile in charge of the local primary school. So I'm afraid I part company with the House of Commons and Public Health England. So who benefits? Here are some of the devices on the left-hand side of your screen that are used for vaping. Vuse, the top one, owned by R.J. Reynolds Vapor Company, a subsidiary of Reynolds America, the second largest tobacco company. Vape, you can see that's the yellow thing, a British American Tobacco, the largest tobacco company in Europe. They've launched Vape. Blue was purchased from Lorillard, then brought back by R.J. Reynolds, then sold to Imperial Tobacco. Atria, previous known as Philip Morris USA, that name of infamy, owns Mark 10 and has a 35% share of Juuls, which are sweeping the market. So be aware that most of these things are made by the tobacco industry. And I'm sure I don't need to have to remind all of you here how transparent the tobacco industry is, how open, what pillars of rectitude they have been for many, many years. The vast majority of the e-cigarette market share are brands owned by the tobacco industry. If that alone doesn't start alarm bells ringing, well, nothing ever will. Slim, sexy, and deadly. What do we know about what is in e-cigarettes? So here they are, more devices. The Juul is that thing in the pale blue background, the second picture. Slim, sexy, and deadly. It looks like a USB. It looks very sexy. They are all basically different ways of administering nicotine and ensuring addiction. And indeed, Juuls have been specifically engineered so you can get a high, a nicotine high, like you get from cigarettes, from the Juuls. There are thousands of different liquids combining thousands of different chemicals. And as an illustration, in 2013-14, Nearly 8,000 different flavor labels available, now doubled in 2016-17, 3 years later, largely unregulated. I would challenge anybody to show me a website where all these devices and liquids are listed, together with the long-term, short-term, and toxicology data on them all. That is Dame Sally Davis, who's our ex-former chief medical officer and a fairly seriously powerful human being with a seriously powerful brain. She doesn't know what's in these things. She has said so publicly. And if Dame Sally doesn't know what's in them, how can you say they are safe? If I gave you a sandwich and said, you'll like this, and you said to me, well, what's in it? I said, I don't know, but you'll like it. Would you eat the sandwich? And talking of eating, eating is not the same as inhaling. One of the mantras of the industry is, oh, these flavors, we eat them all, so they're fine. Well, it's not the same thing, strangely enough. Baker's asthma is caused by allergens in bread flour, and the bakers with baker's asthma can eat bread till all's blue and still be fine. Eating and inhaling are different. Very obvious, but needs to be stressed. And another really key point is that e-cigarettes are not a milk and water version of tobacco. They have their own individual problems. In this one study, there are many. A research bronchoscopy was carried out on smokers, vapors, and controls, and they also did studies in mice. And they looked and they showed that 300 proteins were differentially expressed in smokers and vapors in BAL, of which 113 were only expressed in vapors. They weren't expressed in smokers. E-liquids entered cells and affected membrane fluidity and protein diffusion. Here you can see in this volcano plot the different genes. You can see there's a lot of overlap between smokers and vapors, but there are black dots that are up and down regulated in vapors but not smokers, and red dots ditto. And if you look at this panel here, the overlap between smokers and vapors in another part of the paper, 26 genes upregulated in both, 33 uniquely to vapors. You cannot assume that just because tobacco doesn't cause something, that vaping will not do it. So what is actually inhaled? And I'm grateful to Tom Ferkel for this study. Analyses of the 18 different flavored nicotine and no-nicotine e-cigarette cartridges showed detectable levels of known carcinogens and toxic chemicals. Tobacco-specific impurities potentially harmful to humans were detected in the majority of samples. The amount of nicotine on the label and the amount of nicotine in the puff bore as little relationship to each other as the utterances of politicians and the truth. There were bacterial and fungal contamination of these products very, very commonly. And quality control processes, such as they are either inconsistent or non-existent. Are you still happy that e-cigarettes are so safe? Are you still happy with Public Health England's 95% safety? What about passive vaping? In this study, 9 volunteers vaped various products and puffed them all over the rest. All were occasional tobacco smokers. Again, the label of what was in the nicotine in the cigarettes was not as was advertised. And what they found in the gas phase that people were inhaling substantial increases in a number of highly undesirable chemicals, also found in the urine of the volunteers who passively inhaled. Anybody here seriously want to passively inhale this stuff? And hot off the press, this editorial in Thorax, smoking ban in car protects children, but is vaping the elephant in the car. You can still vape in the car, and I think this should be banned. The authors, who are rather more cautious than I am, call for more research. As far as I'm concerned, I don't want any more research. I want them banned. The emphasis on those who want to have vaping available is to prove that they're safe. It's not up to me to prove that they're not safe. So what are the facts? We do not know what is being inhaled with these nicotine delivery devices, but we do know there is potential for harm. So I would say right away, this puts the Public Health England position completely out of court. So what is the acute toxicity of e-cigarettes? And let's get, this slide seems to have hit a glitch, so I'll try once more to see if the whole slide will come up. You've missed some of the horror pictures of the burn and blast injuries. You can see a burn injury on the arm on the right. The lower slide shows a CT reconstruction of a shattered jaw. This is what happened when an e-cigarette blew up in the person's face. I'll try once more. This was working earlier, but clearly not now. Okay. So what about e-cigarette liquids, lung injury, acute lung injury, e-cigarette and vaping acute lung injury? And these are data from North America, and you can see a terrifyingly rapid increase in reports, 2,500 or more patients, 60 deaths, a recent decline in reported onset, probably due to reporting lag, but a big public health problem. And what did they see? Well, they saw some had acute eosinophilic pneumonia. It's often acute onset, often requires ventilatory support. We had one in Nottingham, Jayesh Bhatt looked after. Eosinophilia, then corticosteroids needed. You may see organizing pneumonia, a lipoid pneumonia, alveolar hemorrhage, all these things. Multiple lung diseases have been described. I wouldn't ask you to read all this, but you can see a list of about 10 or 12 different things that have been described complicating e-cigarette use. And please note that cannabinoids are not always in play. For sure, E-Valley was caused in 80% of cases where deaths were related to cutting e-cigarette liquids with cannabis, but 20% were not. It's not just cannabis. And I would also ask you, are you happy with the distribution of mechanical devices that can be cut with cannabis and cause lethal problems and sending them out to children and young people? It's not just the liquids that are dangerous, the devices are also. And as a practice point, if you see a funny respiratory illness, ask yourself, could this be related to e-cigarettes? Get a history. And again, hot off the press, also from Thorax, this is the bullous lung disease in a 34-year-old man with ground glass shattering, lungs absolute carnage, all the acute result of e-cigarette abuse. Still happy with the toxicity? And there is extensive pulmonary toxicity. Again, thanks to Tom Ferkel for this side. The liquids are toxic to the epithelium, to fibroblasts, to the immune and inflammatory system, and to the endothelium. These are not safe devices to muck around with. What about this mouse model? Well, in some of the E-Valley cases that have been described, high vitamin E levels were described in BAL. So in this case, 30 mice were exposed either to air as a control, vitamin E, or a harmless mixture of polypropylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. In the vitamin E exposed mice, they achieved bowel levels that were similar to those of vapors. They showed evidence of bowel albumin and mononuclear cells and lipid-laden macrophages in the mice exposed to vitamin E. You can see here, this is a mouse BAL. The arrows are pointing to lipid-laden macrophages here and here, pneumocytes over the arrow heads. They saw clusters of lipid-laden macrophages on lung sections, and you can see them outlined here. And this was consistent with the findings of human lipoid pneumonia. This is yet another illustration that something that's safe to eat and indeed essential, like vitamin E, when inhaled, can be exceedingly harmful. What is the chronic toxicity of e-cigarettes? What do we know about chronic toxicity? Well, you may recognize this picture as the late exceedingly great Sir Richard Doll. And this is a chest X-ray showing a lung cancer. Sir Richard Doll, of course, was the great epidemiological investigator who was the very first person to identify that smoking caused lung cancer. It took him many, many decades before he could show that smoking caused lung cancer, and many years before everyone was convinced. During that time, the tobacco industry, who have now reinvented themselves as vapers, talking sanctimoniously about a tobacco-free world, they did their best during that time to suppress data, to obfuscate, to save their skin, to save their industry at the cost of incalculable numbers of deaths and morbidity. We are still, years after Sir Richard Dole has died, we are still making new discoveries about adverse tobacco effects. Are you happy about the long-term effect safety of vaping? They haven't been around a long time. If we were having this discussion after cigarettes have been around for 5 years, no doubt Public Health England would be saying they are very, very safe. We don't have the data. You cannot do a 10-year study in less than 10 years. We do not know what is the chronic toxicity of e-cigarettes. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a fact that you cannot get round. And let's also step back and think about nicotine. I'm not going to spend hours on the adverse effects of nicotine. There are many, but nicotine itself is a poison. And the data I'm going to show you are based on animal experiments exposed to pure nicotine. We know about the adverse effects of cigarettes in pregnancy. Well, in this study, pregnant baboons were exposed to subcutaneous nicotine or placebo, and those exposed to nicotine, the fetal lungs had increased antenatal collagen deposition. Those exposed, again, just to nicotine, not to e-cigarettes, not to tobacco, purely nicotine, had increased MUC5AC expression. And those exposed to nicotine also had airway lengthening and reduced airway caliber, leading to airway hyperresponsiveness in the newborn period, independent of allergen exposure. And we know that newborn airway hyperresponsiveness in children, babies and children, is associated with adverse respiratory outcomes going on into the late teenage years and probably beyond. Nicotine is not safe. E-cigarettes contain nicotine. Cogito ergo sum, e-cigarettes are not safe. This is a mouse emphysema model, 6-week Sprague Dawley rats, and there were 4 groups exposed to room air, subcutaneous nicotine, e-cigarette vapor, and cigarette smoke. And the mice were sacrificed, the rats were sacrificed, and quantitative lung histology was carried out. Here's a panel of the histology. In the top left corner, you can see normal alveolar structure of the Sprague Dawley rat. You can see that it's the nice, beautiful structure, the small alveoli. And if you look in the other panels, you can see the alveoli are large and simplified. There has been failure of secondary septation. And if you look at the alveolar airspace area, the alveoli are bigger in all 3 groups: nicotine, e-cigarettes, and cigarette smoke. And the capillary count is reduced compared with controls. And in this Sprague Dawley rat model, e-cigarette vapor was just as harmful as cigarette smoke, was just as harmful as nicotine. All 3 interventions were equally damaging to the lung. There is, of course, I accept no standard e-cigarette model because there are, as I've shown you, tens of thousands of different devices and liquids. So there's not going to be one. But these to me are extremely worrying data. You have 2 positive controls, cigarette smoke and and nicotine, and e-cigarettes are well up there with the positive controls. What about effects on the innate immune system? And in this case, they looked at induced sputum in smokers, vapors, and normal subjects and did quantitative proteomics. And worryingly, with e-cigarettes, there was increased oxidative stress, increased elastase and matrix metalloproteinases, increased neutrophils and net-associated proteins, changes in mucus composition, and even peripheral neutrophils showed changes in e-cigarette users. And here you can see some of the pathways involved, some common to both e-cigarettes and tobacco, but quite a number, the exclusive provenance of e-cigarettes. I return again to the proposition, e-cigarettes are not just a watered-down version of tobacco. They have their own dangerous properties. So what are the facts? That's the first fact I put across. We don't know what's being inhaled, and they have their own brand of harm. Nicotine is in e-cigarettes. It's a drug of addiction, and on its own is poisonous to the developing lung and elsewhere. So what are the effects on children and young people? How are these e-cigarettes playing out? Who uses what? And I would put to you, this is one of the most terrifying graphs you'll ever see. The red line in USA high school students is e-cigarette use, and you can see that it is taking off dramatically. People say, oh, well, if they weren't doing e-cigarettes, they'd be smoking tobacco. But there is no corresponding drop in tobacco use since vaping took off. The grey line shows that there was a decline in cigarette use before vaping took off, but vaping has completely swept the heap. There is no decline worth squit in the cigarette use. It is completely untrue to say, well, these young people would use cigarettes if they didn't have e-cigarettes. That is rubbish. Now, people want an argument. Is e-cigarette use a gateway to smoking or not? That is the question. But to me, it is not a question at all. I couldn't care less. Why should I care? This is a non-debate. Do we want a generation of nicotine addicts? Even if no one progressed to tobacco, is nicotine addiction as desirable? And this debate, are they a gateway to tobacco smoking, is a very clever tactic by the tobacco industry to divert us down a blind alleyway into a non-debate. And let's get real. Who are these things being targeted at? Who is this? I think the delectable Kate Moss posing with one. Is that really being targeted as smoking cessation? Look at all these flavors. Look at all these sexy devices. The FDA declares youth vaping an epidemic. The Surgeon General has said what we must do more to stem what I see as an epidemic of the use of e-cigarettes amongst teens and deeply disturbing trends that show no signs of abating. The FDA won't tolerate a whole generation of young people becoming addicted to nicotine. Will we? Public Health England seems to be able to. Will we? We need a strong lead. We need a strong lead from the Royal College, which I'm afraid I think is not nearly as strong as it should be. But smoking cessation. That's what the adults say. These things are fantastic for smoking cessation. So these are over 6,000 smokers in a pragmatic trial. They were randomized to usual care versus usual care plus one of free nicotine replacements, free e-cigarettes, free nicotine replacement with a $600 incentive to quit, and free nicotine replacement with a graded $600 deposit, which can be reduced for failed milestones. And guess what? Money talks. You can see here that those who got the money were far more likely to give up smoking. Many of those who gave up smoking with e-cigarettes actually continued to use e-cigarettes. It wasn't that they quit totally. And guess what? NICE do not recommend e-cigarettes as an aid to smoking cessation. Why would that be if they're so good and they're so safe? And how do you advertise smoking cessation? Is it like this? When was the last time you saw a nicotine patch on the shapely naked arm of a nubile young starlet? You just don't. I'm afraid the tobacco industry speaks with forked tongue. They're not advertising for smoking cessation. They are advertising to try to hook a generation of children and young people onto these nicotine addiction devices. And I'm afraid while they're doing it, Public Health England is not so much fiddling while Rome burns, but playing the Brahms violin concerto. The next fact, there is evidence that the evidence that vaping is a gateway to smoking cessation and is being marketed to help stop smoking is simply not there. Instagram. My friends will be well aware that to me, the height of technology is unscrewing the cap of a fountain pen. But so I'm speaking it very secondhand. Instagram posts. This group analyzed 250,000 posts over 4 years. And the vaping hashtags, liking vaping, were used 10,000 times more than the FDA warnings. After a warning was instituted, there were 3 times more likes of vaping and 6 times more posts with more than 100 likes about vapes. Pods with a nicotine surge, Juuls, much more often targeted. Worryingly, underage followers of Instagram were being recorded. And you can see these are the sorts of things. Promote the blue, promotions, dark blue, devices, flavors, user experience. Those with really sharp eyes, just look right in the middle. There's this tiny little dot, hashtag the real cost. 48 posts about the real cost of using e-cigarettes, compared with tens of thousands of everything else. These things are playing out big time popular to children and young people. So the marketing strategy is not as an aid to smoking cessation, but as a means of getting the young addicted to nicotine. And I would put to you that the evidence for these 4 statements is absolutely rock solid and incontrovertible. So what are my take-home messages from this presentation? I'd like to start with the Federation of International Respiratory Societies position. This is a collaborative of 9 international professional organizations, and they have made the following recommendations concerning e-cigarettes in children and young people. And the European Respiratory Society is one of those who've signed up to this, the American Academy of Pediatrics ditto, many across the world. Electronic nicotine delivery systems should be considered tobacco products and regulated as such, including for taxation and including advertising and everything else. The sale of electronic cigarettes to children and young people must be prohibited by all nations and those bans enforced. I haven't shown the data, but it is perfectly clear that if you're underage, you can access these things very, very easily. You can do it online, no problem at all. There's got to be means of enforcement. All forms of promotion must be regulated, and all advertising in media, including social media, accessible to children and young people, should cease. Flavorings should be banned. Jeff Drazen also called for that in a New England Journal editorial. Why do you want flavoring except to hook people on them? Regular surveillance should be performed to better understand the scope and health threat of tobacco products to children and young people. The Federation of International Respiratory Societies takes this with deadly seriousness, and I use the word deadly deliberately. So my take-home message is, firstly, vaping is promulgated by the tobacco industry, those pillars of rectitude and transparency, and is for practical purposes totally unregulated. Public Health England say we are regulating them. Show me the data. Show me the evidence. The fact is, if the tobacco industry tried to sell me anything, a new car, a used car, anything, I would run a mile, and I suggest you do the same. Vaping acute reactions are worse than those of tobacco. The equivalent of E-valley, e-cigarettes and vaping-associated lung injury, you don't see with tobacco. They are the acute reactions are definitely worse. And it's no good saying, oh, it's all just cannabis, because it isn't. That is wrong. And for all of us, if we see a respiratory oddity, we should be asking ourselves, could this be due to vaping? It took decades for the long-term harm of tobacco to be detected. When are we going to know about the long-term harm of vaping? And are we going to just sit on our hands and twiddle our thumbs while we're waiting? I would put to you, we should not. The evidence for smoking cessation is underwhelming. The evidence that they are being marketed to children is overwhelming. I would ask you, can you propound a biologically plausible model whereby inhaling a lot of hot chemicals of unknown provenance into your airways is anything other than a thoroughly bad idea. The vaping industry has the siren cry, we need more research. No, we don't. We don't need any more research at all. We want to ban them. If the vaping industry thinks they're so safe, let them prove it, and good luck to them. But the onus, the monkey is on their shoulder to prove they're safe, not on my shoulder to prove they're harmful. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. I think a quotation from Einstein. We were fooled once by the tobacco industry with tobacco cigarettes. Are we going to be fooled twice by e-cigarettes? Public Health England, in my view, are catastrophically wrong. They are out of step with all the world, and I'm afraid for good and honourable reasons, a lot of our adult physician colleagues are signed up to Public Health England's proposition. I respect my adult colleagues, but their views on this are wrong. And so, having thrown away any chance I might have of a knighthood by trashing Public Health England, I'll leave you with the last slide. These are my 6 grandchildren at Christmas, including 2 twins. I want to protect these guys from exposure to e-cigarettes. And I think unless we make some effective steps now, we as the pediatric community, they are going to be very, very vulnerable to their effects. So thank you for your attention, and thanks once more for the invitation to speak.
Thank you very much, Andy, for the excellent talk. Chris, how can we change the view and policies of public health, and why are they not listening to this data?
We have to keep on and on hammering at it. I think that I don't know if there are any college officers in the audience. I am disappointed by the RCPCH stance on this. I would challenge people, what is the RCPCH stance? I haven't actually seen very much from them. There is a vape shop just down the road from the college. All of us need to unite to say, look, there are specific pediatric issues. Whether or not they're good for adults for smoking cessation, I'm not going to adjudicate on, although NICE has and says they're not. We've got to keep hammering at it that this is a public health emergency for children, and keep on and on and on, at least in my view.
Thank you, Andy. Noreen, when a parent of a child with asthma smugly tells you that they switched from tobacco smoking to e-cigarettes, what do you say to them?
I would say to them, well done for stopping tobacco. Now the next step is to stop e-cigarettes, because they have also serious harms to your child with asthma. So please take the next step and stop. If you can't do that, then use nicotine gum or patches. But above all, get your GP to refer you to a smoking cessation clinic. And again, I think I would challenge us all as a pediatric community. We all take a smoking history. We should all take a vaping history, and we should be ready to suggest to parents that they should be referred by the GP to smoking cessation clinics to maximize their chances of quitting.
Thank you, Andy. Rabina, our hospital trust allows vaping and supports nicotine replacements while the patient and visitor visit the hospital, but have banned smoking. How can we challenge our chief executive?
Take my slides and show them to the chief executive, or any number of public things. If somebody wants to use a nicotine patch or nicotine chewing gum while visiting a hospital, fine, no problem. If they want to vape, that's an absolute disgrace, and it should not be allowed. And the chief executive of that hospital and the board should be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. You should go to a public board meeting and actually raise that issue with the evidence.
Thank you, Andy. Andy, I know about the college stance, but should we not go back to college and force college once the COVID-19 things have slightly settled down for them to have a position on it?
Well, we should, and we shouldn't wait for COVID-19. The president very rightly highlighted the danger that in the COVID-19 crisis, where there are so many very, very sick adults and so many resources are being taken from pediatrics to support the adult crisis, and quite understandably and rightly, we shouldn't lose sight of children's needs. I mean, our PICU is probably about to be taken over for adult patients, and I can see the justification for that. But that shouldn't stop us thinking also about the collateral damage to children. And guess what? The vaping industry are not going to be quiet during the COVID epidemic. They're not going to go into they're not going to go into recession. They're going to keep campaigning. And so, all of us campaign with the college. We've done it, not successfully.
Thank you, Andy. A few more. We measure carbon monoxide, urine nicotine for tobacco smoke. Is there any measure available for vaping which we can measure, and what?
Yeah, so I would give urinary cotinine. These things contain nicotine, and you can measure that in urine. I don't know what the equivalent levels are for passive vaping and active vaping in the urine. I suspect they're pretty similar to tobacco. So yes, please continue to measure urine cotinine. Carbon monoxide, I don't have the data. I suspect it would also show up, but certainly cotinine in the urine or saliva will.
So 2 questions from Satish. TFL adverts of vaping all over the tube and buses, first. And then the second is, what should we tell parents who say they smoke outside the house?
Well, first of all, the comment about vaping advertisements all over London is absolutely spot on, and it's an absolute disgrace. It's like going back to the bad old days of tobacco advertising. It's a disgrace that they're allowed, and we should campaign vigorously against them. And if you look at those advertisements, I would challenge anybody to find the least hint that they are targeting smokers who want to quit. They're not. They're saying, this is guys, this is a really cool, sexy habit. You take it up. That's what they're doing. Sorry, and the second question was?
Yeah, I think you answered both of them, Andy. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Andy.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for a great meeting, Atul.